A role-playing game is a game in which you have a cooperative group, and that group is working on building a story.
You are not yourself, and you're portraying the role of another character, persona, so on and so forth.
The idea behind the role-playing game is that the players that come in provide the characters in kind of like a cinematic feature, and the role of the game master is just to apply rules and physics to that game to allow you to know what you can do, can't do, could probably do, and to add structure to the story.
It is a role-playing game that is on pen and paper where you roll dice to decide your fate.
D&D takes role-playing and it makes a game out of it. It adds like statistics, mechanics, so that you can role-play as the character you've created. And it can be in our world, another world. It can have fantasy, it can have sci-fi elements, just depends on the group.
I've been a long-time role player, and so as far as role-playing games, I've played Dungeons & Dragons. I currently also play Pathfinder. I played Heroes Unlimited, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the role-playing game, Firefly, Shadowrun. There was GURPS. I've also played a bunch of Western-type games. So basically, any interest that you have in terms of a story, a genre, a field, a history, there's normally a role-playing game that's tied to it. I think the main thing you need for Dungeons & Dragons, it helps to have the core rule books. It helps to have access to the internet because a lot of that's on there. But really the main thing you need is some dice for determining probability, a pencil and paper to record things on, and most importantly, an imagination.
D&D, I think you just need dice. You don't have to have a board, you don't have to have the little miniatures, you don't really need the rule books because you can honestly not go heavily. I think the one thing that's hard to replicate is a random number generator that would be not dice. So you just need dice pretty much.
If you have a good enough DM, you don't even have to have rules. All you have to have is the player's trust.
How I actually heard about D&D was when I was in the 3rd grade. I happened to find my dad's 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons player handbook, and I looked at him and said, "You're a nerd." And he was like, "Hey, you came from these nerds' loins, so you can't even say anything about it." And I was like, okay, sure. How I actually got into playing D&D was much, much later after I found out what it was. I had moved to this new town, and I had met new friends and new faces where they actually were a bunch of nerds, happen chance. And these nerds thought maybe, just maybe, this guy would like playing as barbarian in front of everybody else. And I thought, the opportunity to hit something while simultaneously not hitting something, very enticing. So I took it and ran with it. And now here we are.
I learned about Dungeons & Dragons for the very first time when I was in junior high, and that would have been 1982? Yeah, around 1982. It was really funny because back then no one knew who it was. It was before it kind of had hit any level of popularity. So it was like, hey, it's a board game, but it's not a board game. Well, what do we do? Well, you have to act like you're a person. I'm like, yeah, okay, so where's the figure? Well, there's not any figures. And I was like, this doesn't make sense. So the first time I did, it was very strange. I had no idea what was going on.
I got into D&D around my freshman year. That's when Stranger Things came out. That was like a big, like hyped up D&D stuff because I was like, look at how fun these characters, they're playing D&D. That's so cool. And I was in theater at the time, so you just grab a bunch of theater kids and they're all ready to play D&D and whatnot. So
whenever I make a character for Dungeons & Dragons, I usually will pick what class I want to be first. Then I will usually reference the Dungeon Master to see what like the overarching storyline is. And then after that, I will try and figure out what would make sense to happen in that world.
there's multiple ways to start. You can choose like an idea of what you want to do. If you want to play like a certain class or certain race, or sometimes you can just put a bunch of stuff together that look cool to you, and it doesn't have to be exactly the most optimized build, but it's stuff that you're like, I think it'd be funny, and I like that.
One of the things that you want to look at is your character's race, where they were born, what was their culture, how are they raised, what kind of world did they come up in, what are their thoughts, what's their ethos, what's their history, who do they have relationships with and why. You want to build as complete of a person or a story as you can around that person, because those choices help inform you later in the midst of combat.
You can either portray like a lifestyle that you would want to live or that you think is fun, or you could try like, let me try something else, like play a gender that I don't identify with. Let me play a background that I'm not associated with. And yeah, it's interesting to put your eyes through that character.
As a player, one of my favorite things is when I create a character that I invest myself in enough, that has a backstory, a history, has an ethos that he believes in, and he's put into a situation where he would do something that I, Rob Bartley, would not do.
My favorite thing about being a player is always messing up the DM. It is so much fun to derail him. That and also combat. Combat's always fun.
My personal favorite thing about D&D is the ending of fight sequences.
I don't really prefer the combat side of D&D. I'm more of the role-playing aspects. Once it goes to combat, most characters I build aren't made for that. The DM is the dungeon master. This is what most people refer to. They're like the god of the game. They are the rules. They define when you roll. They say, this is what happens. Because otherwise, you'd just roll, and then you'd be like, I think this is what happens. I don't know.
Okay, so the DM's role, to some degree, is to play God in the universe. Normally, it's your job to bring the adventure to life, to put the setting into place, to help the characters experience the place that they're in, since it's all imagination.
Like how a person interacts with a video game, like the Dungeon Master basically is the video game.
It leans heavily on your skill of narrative and explaining. For example, it's one thing if you're a player and I tell you, you and your friends are headed down this hallway, there's 2 doors on the left and 1 on the right. And that's fine, that's a great expository. But I can make it a lot more fun for you if I just add in elements of, like, in the darkness, you feel the cobwebs brush against your face as you hear the feet of small rodents running. You can't quite see ahead, but you can barely make out 2 doors that seem to be on your left with a green light coming out underneath. You hear a chain rattle, and over to your right, you see a red light flicker underneath another door. Like, suddenly that setting becomes more alive, and you have a better presence of feeling like you're there.
My favorite thing about DMing is I could say whatever goes, and they have to listen to me. No, my favorite thing about DMing is probably their reactions whenever I'm telling my side of the story, and they're just listening along, being able to finally hear how all their parts are playing in.
One of my favorite things about running games is bringing enjoyment out of players, finding out what types of the game they like to play and giving them an experience where they have fun. I love nothing more than having new players come in and finding out, do they like the combat? Do they like going and getting the most powerful guy and finding loot and riches? Do they want intrigue? Do they want a political story, very Game of Thrones, in which they have to figure things out? Or maybe it's a mystery, or sometimes it's a horror and they want something to scare them. And it's fun to me to play that game and give someone a rewarding experience, and to see them get to enjoy themselves in a way that's really not presented in another media type.
What makes a good DM is a simple matter of opinion, because every player has their own preferences of how they want to play. And not every single DM can appease those at the same time. So I think a really good DM is just anybody who's willing to commit time.
I think that D&D is different because there's no real boundaries in D&D. By other forms of entertainment, if you're watching a movie, you're like, there's going to be a specific thing that happens every single time I watch this movie. Video games, even, you have to, you're bound by the game's mechanics. Like, certain games won't let you jump or certain games won't let you fight. But with D&D, you can do anything. Like, if you want to say, I want to try to this, if the DM allows it, then it happens, because it's all in your imagination. You can do whatever you want.
It's so interactive, but also in person, and you're also in the story yourself. while also making the characters. It's like a play, but you're in it while also watching it.
We all have a creative storytelling element to the things that we enjoy in terms of media. And being able to do that cooperatively has an appeal. I think it's also an area where people that were maybe a little less social could come together with hobbies that they were a little less social in and socially interact around that common theme. And that kind of took off. The other thing that I think that makes a big difference also is that a lot of social activities are tied to around other things like, say, athletics. And, you know, it's great to enjoy your friends that play basketball, but not if you're a bad basketball player. Everybody can have a good imagination. Everyone can have a story to tell. Everyone can participate in a conversation or be, you know, part of an adventure. And that's what I think part of the universal appeal is.
If anybody ever wants to get into D&D but is too nervous, I would just tell them, hey, look, everybody has a first time. I'm just...
I think probably the hardest part is self-consciousness, especially if you're not aware of Dungeons and Dragons and you haven't seen it played before. You're afraid of, like, what if I go in there and I say something wrong, or I do something wrong, or I get made fun of, or someone gets mad at me. And I think that's really one of the areas where YouTube has helped a lot, and shows like Critical Role, where people get the opportunity to watch other people role play. So they kind of have that model built in there that they know it's okay if I go in and I crack a joke, or if I roll the dice wrong, or I don't know a rule. And normally good players and good DMs are forgiving and will like make the difference and help players along. And it's been a community in the time that I've played where everybody tends to be that way. I've had very few bad experiences with players that are just, you know, toxic or garbage.
There's always people around who want to play D&D. They're just too nervous. So if you just have the guts to ask them, or if you know anybody else who already plays or DMs, then you could just always ask them. It's a very inviting environment for everybody because it's very inclusive for the fact that it's role-playing, so you don't have to be yourself. Even if the person doesn't like you, they don't have to like you. They just have to like your character.
I'd say something like go to your local game shop. Most times, places that like have trading cards and whatnot, they have these games going on, and so to get into D&D, you just go to those games. You say, hey, are there any games that I can join? I can make a character real quick. And that's how I would recommend getting into the game if you don't have another group.
The community for Dungeons and Dragons, from what I've seen, is very like open and welcoming to any new players. I haven't found anyone that's like gatekeeping it.
I think when people think about D&D and its nerdiness, it holds very true because it came up. It was made in the 70s, and it's a bunch of people sitting around like dice. It's a very more accepted thing. Like, it's not as much as when everything that was associated with nerd culture was associated with the devil. Like, it's a lot more people will be like, yeah, I'll let my kid play D&D.
There are an element of people that have a hard time socializing. But if you give them rules and a construct and a story to work within, and you give them the freedom to use their imagination to be who they want to be, not who they feel like they're supposed to be, who they want to be, it gives them the green light to really kind of open up and explore the feelings and emotions, say, of another person in a way that they may not feel comfortable doing on their own. So, like, I know friends that are really, they're very introverted. If you talk to them in person, it's hard to kind of get to know them and stuff like that. But boy, you put a bag of dice in front of them and tell them to pick a character, and you can't shut them up. I mean, they just come alive playing because they let themselves into that element because they feel safe doing it.
To say that Dungeons and Dragons is only played by nerds, do you know any non-gangsters that listen to rap? Do you know any non-cardigan wearing people who listen to Taylor Swift? You know, these are just things that you try to fit into a mold that isn't there because there is no mold. It's just for everybody.
In one sentence, D&D is whatever you want it to be.
Dungeons and Dragons is the most interactive game I have ever and probably will ever play.
Dungeons and Dragons is probably the most beautiful thing that has ever happened to me.
Dungeons and Dragons is an incredible way to get a group of people together and allow them to corporately form inspirational, entertaining stories.